Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about the January 2024 breach of Microsoft. This was carried out by the Russian intelligence services. It goes by many names, but that's what we're going to focus on today. Just quick agenda. We will start off and talk about what the SVR actually did, what their campaign looked like. We'll go through the breach impact. So what are the actual consequences of what occurred in January? Talk about the whole situation, what they could expect as far as aftermath and impact goes. We'll take a quick break. So probably about 10:50 or so, we'll take about a 5-10 minute break. When we come back from that, we'll do a hands-on exercise. So when we get to that point, I'll share some instructions with you. We have a whole lab set up so you can try out the attack that we're going to discuss today. And then we'll wrap it up with key takeaways and lessons learned and answer any questions that you may have. One thing that I will say is if you have any questions, please feel free in the webinar here at any time to raise your hand or pop it in the chat. Happy to answer questions as they come along. No need to wait till we get to a certain point. Very quickly, just want to kind of tell you who I am so you know who you're talking to. My name is Cory Wolff. I'm the Director of Offensive Security here at Risk 360. I've been involved with development, IT, and security forever. I work on the Red Team Village at DEF CON, and there's 2 links. So if you ever want to get in touch with me, please feel free to reach out to me via those links, and happy to talk at any time. A few notes about today. So you might have seen that there are CPE credits being offered for today. If you would like to receive those credits, there will be some questions that pop up throughout the course of the workshop here today. If you want to receive those CPE credits, please make sure that you answer those questions. Because it's important as far as us providing those credits to you. So you'll see them throughout the course of the presentation. They should just pop up in Zoom. You just answer the question. I'm not going to try to stump you, but please make sure that you answer those questions. The other part is, we're going to kind of break this down into both technical and then non-technical. So the first half of this, we're going to keep it at pretty high level. We're not going to get too caught up into the specific technical details of what occurred. But we're going to talk about through the methodology, how they gained access, how they went from basically a test tenant to a production tenant. And then the second half, again, we'll open up a lab so you can try these things out for yourself. You should have gotten an email regarding the setup for that technical portion today. It's somewhat simple, but in order to complete that lab portion for today, you will need to install the Microsoft Graph SDK for PowerShell. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. And the lab will be available until Friday. So if you want to take the rest of the week and try these things out at either a different pace or try something out that you've been wanting to try for quite some time, this is a pretty good opportunity to do that. And so the lab will remain open until Friday. So you might, I don't know if you can see, but Andy is here with us, and Andy's, I believe, going to pop up some of these questions as we walk through this. And so with that, we mentioned the CPE credits. If you want to receive CPE credits, there should be a question that pops up here in just a minute. All right, I think pretty much everybody that wanted to answer can answer. You can still answer that question as we move on. But yes, please make sure you answer those. So let's start with a quick overview of what happened. Again, from a high level, what actually occurred. So on January 19th, Microsoft announced through a blog post and through an associated 8K SEC filing that they had identified a breach. So one of the real interesting things about the SEC filing in this case is that, as most of us are probably aware, there's the new requirement to file with the SEC if you're a public company, to file with the SEC if you've had a cyber incident. And so Microsoft did that. What's interesting though is that this is being seen as the right way to disclose that 8K, or to publish that 8K. They gave just the right amount of information, not too much, not too little, and did a really good job of explaining, at a high level what happened. Um, there's been some other ones. So I think it was the Avanti one most recently where they did an 8K and they basically, it's just like one sentence, we had a breach, which, isn't the greatest way to disclose. But Microsoft's being seen as the right way to do this new 8K requirement when it comes to cyber incidents. And in it, what they talked about was how on January 12th, they had identified a cyber incident, including a nation state threat actor, which was later attributed to there's many names for a lot of these organizations, but it was later attributed to what Microsoft refers to as Midnight Blizzard. And they said that they'd had access since late November 2023. So, late November 2023, they identified the incident January 12th. And ultimately, what happened was there was an application and a test tenant of Microsoft's that had, and I believe how they worded it was elevated access to the Microsoft corporate environment. So on the 19th of January, they disclosed it. They discovered it on the 12th of January, and the threat actors had access sometime late November 2023. One of the big things about this is that the Russian intelligence service is one of the best in the world. They really are. These are the same threat actors responsible for the SolarWinds attack. They're the same threat actors responsible for lots of high profile incidents. And so the thing about it is, while they are extremely advanced, what they did is not a new approach. It's not new. This is something that, myself and my team and many other teams, when they're completing cloud penetration tests, do. They performed an activity known as service principal abuse, which we'll get into in a little bit more depth here in just a bit. But this is something that's been around for a while. In fact, we'll share the slide deck with you at the end here, and there's a bunch of links at the last slide. And there's a link in there talking about this specifically. And I believe it's from 2019 or 2020. But the fact of the matter is what they did was it is a known threat vector. It's a known way to privilege escalate in Azure, to start with the low level user and work your way up to global admin. And they executed it perfectly. Also, just by what we know from Microsoft's disclosures, is that the threat actors most likely had complete access to the Microsoft production tenant. They most likely had complete access. And we'll dive into that specifically, why that's the case, why that's probably the case. But at the end of the day, what occurred was there was a test tenant that had an application in it. That application had elevated access to the Microsoft production tenant. And through service principal abuse, the threat actors were able to pivot and gain elevated access to the Microsoft corporate tenant. So it really boils down to third-party applications, what's also known as enterprise applications, if you're looking through your Azure portal there. But again, went from a test tenant to a production Microsoft corporate environment through an application. So there's a couple questions that, as leaders, we should really be asking when we talk about these things. These are good questions to know the answers to, and this is a good starting point. And so that's why we're talking about it now, because these kind of questions are the questions we should be asking to, one, really understand where we're at when it comes to enterprise applications. Also, do we truly understand the risks? So are we being targeted by nation state threat actors? Have we been in the past? How do we know? And so, I just want to throw these in here because these are the questions that you want to ask in order to get a good understanding to a classic attack, service principal abuse, that will help you down the path to really understand how to monitor these applications, how to understand the risk from the applications, how to understand the risk between IAM, so identity and access management. There's a reason that organizations have whole departments devoted strictly to IAM, right? So these are just some questions we want to throw in there. They're good conversation starters. They're good ways to start down a strategic path. And so those are just some that again, we wanted to share with you today. So if you have any questions about that, please make sure to reach out. Speaking of Black Hat ransomware group, they just took off with $22 million. Or maybe it was Alpha V. I think they're the same group. You should Google it if you're interested. If you know anything about ransomware and ransomware as a service, they work with affiliate programs, and they got a pretty big payment. One of their affiliates got a pretty big payment, $22 million in the past week. And Black Hat didn't pay it out. They just took the money and shut down shop and went home. So you should check it out. You should read it if you haven't already. So what do we know? So as I mentioned before, we know that between the SEC 8K that Microsoft released and the associated blog post where they gave us some an overview of what occurred, we can start to piece together the attack path and what the threat actors actually did to gain access to the tenant. There's a couple of things that we need to kind of understand first. And really, we need to understand these things going forward, right? So first and foremost, when we talk about applications, we talk about when we're thinking about Entra ID, everything is an object, right? And it was the same thing with on-premises Active Directory. It's based on LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. So it's based on LDAP, but in on-premise Active Directory and in Azure Active Directory and in Entra ID, whatever they're calling it this week, everything is an object. And so when we talk about service principals, there are user principals that represent users, excuse me. And so of course, service principals represent services. So when we have an application and a tenant, there's the application, but then there's also a service principal that represents that application. And this service principal can have its own set of roles, of permissions. It can essentially do everything that any other object can do. And this is where things start to get tricky. So an application could have a service principal. So you create an application in one tenant, right? And then if that application authenticates to another tenant, it's the same application, right? So if you were to actually look at the properties of each of those applications, they would have the same application ID in each tenant, but they would have different service principal IDs. And that's important to understand because just because an app lives in one tenant doesn't mean that it doesn't have properties, aka roles and permissions, in another tenant. And so when we talk about service principal abuse, this is what we're talking about, is that service principal in our discussion today in the production tenant has its own properties and its own roles and permissions, right? So that's good to just kind of understand as we talk through this. But if we want to start, if we look at the blog post from Microsoft, they start off by saying that the threat actor gained access to the test tenant through password spraying. Password spraying is a little bit different than password brute forcing. Brute forcing, you have maybe 100 emails and 1,000 different passwords, and you try all those passwords against all those emails. Password spraying is a little bit more targeted, where you would have 200 emails and maybe only 4 or 5 passwords. When me and my team do this, it's unfortunately typically things like summer 2023 exclamation mark, spring 2024 exclamation mark, company name 2024 exclamation mark. But you take 4 or 5 targeted passwords and you take a bigger list of emails and spray those passwords against those emails. So in this case, the Russian intelligence services performed a password spray on the test tenant that belonged to Microsoft. But the one thing that I did want to call out here was they say, in addition, as we explain in more detail below, the threat actor reduced the likelihood of discovery by launching these attacks from a distributed residential proxy infrastructure. So this is interesting because this is just another way to evade detection. Microsoft has a smart lock, so that when they detect possible password brute forcing, they'll automatically lock the account. There's lots of ways that they do that, detecting from IP, heuristic detection methods, other ways that they do it. But what happens with a residential proxy network or infrastructure, as they mentioned it here today, is threat actors have botnets. Botnets are most known for distributed denial of service attacks. So, that's typically what you hear when you think of botnet. But there's lots of other uses for botnets, and one of them being residential proxies. So if we think about a botnet, they're composed of PCs, phones, media devices. Half the time, if you buy a Android-based, media player from Amazon or eBay or something, a lot of them have some sort of malware on them, unfortunately. But these botnets are comprised of many different devices. So what a threat actor could do is they could connect to that botnet and connect to any of those devices in that botnet and send their traffic through there. So instead of coming from wherever they are, the traffic looks like it's coming from Cory's Fire Stick, right? Or Cory's PC, whatever it might be. And they're able to send their traffic out through different IP addresses, which then lowers the detection of being detected by Microsoft as being a password spraying or a password brute forcing attack. They can set a random IP that it comes out of, or they can set a specific IP address, whatever they want. But what this does is it allows them to send their traffic out through many different endpoints so that Microsoft or any other defense sees lots of different IPs making connections, and it reduces the chances of being detected, really is what it does. So these aren't things that you would see from run-of-the-mill, I guess, threat actors. If you're on the dark web, you can buy access to one of these proxy networks. And it's just another really good way to obfuscate your traffic, which of course they did in this case. So that's where it started. They performed password spraying through a residential proxy. And what do you know it? They gained access to a user in a test tenant. So at this point, they had a user. They're in a test tenant. What are they going to do? If we follow along with the information that Microsoft provided, Midnight Blizzard, as they referred to Russian intelligence services, Midnight Blizzard leveraged their initial access to identify and compromise a legacy test OAuth application that had elevated access to the Microsoft corporate environment. So what does that mean? If we think about the service principles again, what this really means is that there was an application in the test tenant and an account, whether it was a user or a service, but some sort of account based in the production tenant authenticated to that application. And so what happens in that particular case is a service principal is created in the production tenant. So when they say elevated access, that's what they're talking about. They're saying that a user or service belonging to their production tenant authenticated to this application in the test tenant, which then created a service principal, which is just a representation of the application in the production tenant, aka the Microsoft corporate environment. The thing about this is that if that application in the test tenant requested, a global admin, which I don't even think you can through OAuth, but as an example, if that application in the test tenant requested global admin and the user who authenticated to that application in the test tenant consented, that's what we say in OAuth consented to that permission, the application in the production tenant would then have global admin in this theoretical example. I don't think you can actually grant that through OAuth, but that's just an example. So whatever permissions the application requests, if the user has the permissions to give and the user consents, then that application in the production tenant will get those permissions. And so this is what happened. They compromised a user in the test tenant. That user, in one way or another, maybe it was the owner of the application, maybe it was an app admin in the test tenant. There's lots of different permissions or roles that would allow the user they compromised to have access to this application. But they compromised this user. The user had elevated access to the application. And at some point in the past, the application was authenticated to from an account in the production tenant, which then created that service principal or representation of the application in the production tenant, which had all of those permissions. Now, in this case, as we go through the attack path, there's a couple of actions that were taken by the threat actors, which indicate that this application either most likely had either app role assignment, read write all, or role management read write all, which we'll get into in just a minute here.
Cory, I have a question that came through relating to this topic. Okay to interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
So the question was, wouldn't the logs trigger multiple login attempts? Shouldn't that trigger an alarm? Question from an early starter in the cybersecurity space.
So it does, yes. So this is where you start to get down the path of why your defensive posture needs to be in place. So yes, there's logs of that password spray, which once Microsoft detected or identified that there was an incident, they probably went back and saw them. Why it didn't trigger an alert, I don't know. This is when we talk about things like purple teaming, adversary emulation, this is what we're doing. We're running different attacks to see if an alert pops up. But just because you have the logging in place doesn't necessarily mean that the SOC SIM, the reporting infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's alerting on it. To have the logs is one thing. To alert on the logs is another thing. And that's the big challenge. That's where things like adversary emulation and purple teaming come in, because you can say, hey, we ran a password spray attack against a tenant. One, did the logs pick it up, which typically they do, but then two, did you get an alert on it? And those alerts are all crafted nowadays. It's moving more towards AI generating these alerting mechanisms. But yes, they're in the logs somewhere. Why it didn't pop an alert, I don't know. Maybe they just weren't popping alerts for this particular test tenant. Most likely what happened here was that there was either a user or group in Microsoft that was just trying something out or developing something and left this test tenant open. So if it was left open, then alerting probably wouldn't have been fine-tuned for that particular resource. But yes, ultimately the logs are there, but whether or not you alert on them is a different question. So,
Cory, thank you for that. And there was just one more that came in a few minutes ago. Is there any answer to how do we know if we have been targeted by nation state actors?
So that's where a lot of, so me and my team are on the technical side of the house. But on the other side of the house is GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And this is where things like risk assessments come into play. you should be performing. So, I mean, of course, just a basic NIST 800 risk assessment will start to answer some of these questions. Um, but that's really where it starts to come into play. From a GRC perspective, you should be performing some sort of risk management and understanding what those risks are, where they come from. Most likely, if you're the target of a nation state, you fall under a couple of different industries. So, of course, critical infrastructure. If you're in critical infrastructure, the answer is yes. Yes. If you have extremely valuable intellectual property, Chinese APTs. So that's the difference, right? So if you think about these threat actors and their motives, Chinese APTs, for example, traditionally have gone after intellectual property, right? Whereas like a ransomware group, for example, doesn't really care who they go after. They just basically spray the internet and see what they can find for all intents and purposes. But that's an example where if you have highly valuable IP, well, maybe some APT that's been known to go after intellectual property is going to come after you. But that's where things like risk assessments come in, really understanding the risk that your organization faces, and then some just real easy ones. If you're critical infrastructure, yes, the answer is yes, and go from there. Cool. Appreciate the questions. Okay. So so at this point, the threat actors had some sort of elevated access to the production tenant. And so this is where things start to get interesting. This is when we talk about service principal abuse. This is what we're talking about. This application in the production tenant was granted, again, most likely app those two permissions you see there, app role assignment or role management, most likely. But let's look a little bit further into what Microsoft said here. Following along their blog post, they create a new user account to grant consent in the Microsoft corporate environment to the threat actor controlled malicious OAuth applications. So those malicious OAuth applications we'll talk about in just a minute. The threat actor then uses a legacy test OAuth application. And when Microsoft talking in their blog post about the legacy test OAuth application, they're talking about that one on the left. That's what they're referring to, the legacy test OAuth application. They're referring to it as a legacy because I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Microsoft refers to it as a legacy application because anything before, I think, November 2020 or 2021, something, I don't remember the date exactly. Anything before that date is considered a legacy application, and that's because Microsoft started to implement more restrictions on apps. Things like, you need to be, if you want to distribute your application, you need to be a Microsoft certified developer and those kinds of things. So I believe that that's why they're referring to it as a legacy test OAuth application. But that's what they're referring to. They're referring to the one on the left. But ultimately, in their blog post, they say that the legacy test OAuth application created a new user account and then gave the full access as app role to Exchange Online. So this is why, earlier I said is most likely a full compromise of the Microsoft tenant. This is why this is most likely. Because in order for the threat actor to create a user account and to grant that full access as app role in the production environment, in the Microsoft corporate environment, just in order to do those things, they would need elevated permissions. And there's only a handful of permissions that really would allow, creating users and assigning those app roles. So the thing about it is, and this is why IAM is such a challenge, is that the thing about it is that they will, some permissions allow to assign other permissions. And so in the previous slide, when we said that the app in the test tenant most likely had app role assignment.readwrite.all, because one, that's a common one that you see on applications. And two, that permission allows for the assignment of other roles. So if you have that role, you can just give the application whatever role you want, or the user whatever role you want. It's an app. in this case. You can give the application whatever role you want. So it doesn't sound that dangerous, but app role assignment.read write all allows an application to grant itself or any other object in Azure AD any role, right? So while that role itself might not actually be global admin, it can make itself global admin. And so when we talk about service principal abuse, this is what we typically see is that there's a role assigned to an application such as this one that allows it to grant itself privileged permissions. And in order to do that, again, if it was able to create a new user and assign that app role, it had an elevated permission, which if it can assign an app role or create a user, it could pretty much do anything else, right? So that's what they did. They moved into the production tenant. They, using the service principal that was created in the production tenant, they created a new user, and they added two new applications. So in this case, we don't know the actual names of the applications. Microsoft hasn't told us. But in this case, we're just using as an example attacker app 1, attacker app 2. So they created the user. They created two other applications. And so one thing to call out here is that those attacker app 1 and 2 don't necessarily even need to have anything to do with the test tenant or the production tenant. Anyone can create a OAuth application in Microsoft. Anyone. And so if you can get a target, so let's say, so this is something that referred to as consent phishing or OAuth phishing, which is something my team and I do all the time. It's where, so anyone can create an application in Entra ID. And if we are able to get a target to authenticate to our application, and we ask for, directory.read write all, which allows us to read and write all of Active Directory. If we get a user to consent to our application to give us the permission of directory.read write all, and that user does, our application can now read and write directory, Active Directory. And so what we can do is, through a phish, through a text, through various other means, create a malicious app like Document Manager, right? As an example, create an app called Document Manager, tell the user they need to review some documents for whatever reason, send them a link that says Document Manager wants access to your Microsoft account. And if they click OK, we just gained access to the tenant. And so in this case, those attacker app 1 and attacker app 2 don't even necessarily need to live in Microsoft's corporate environment. They could live anywhere they want. So long as they can get a user or an application in the production tenant to consent to their apps, that's all they need. And so that's what they did. They created a user. They created two new applications, which again, where they live, we don't know, but it doesn't really matter. And using the user that they just created, they consented to their applications, and then again, using their elevated role, they gave those applications a full access as app role, which ultimately, they gave those applications a full access as app role for Exchange Online. So that's what happened there. So at the end of the day, at this point, they have fully compromised the tenant. They fully compromised the environment. There's no other way for them to create a user or even get the permissions to create a user or grant the full access as app role through that service principal abuse without elevated permissions. So really what happened was, by this point here, it's basically game over. I mean, they've got it. They've got whatever access they want. For the most part, they could probably do whatever they want to do and go forward. They're essentially global admin at that point. So why would they go and do all this? Why would they go through the hassle of creating another user, creating applications, having that user authenticate to them, and then, granting access to Exchange to those applications? Why would they go through all that? Um, my guess is because if we remember who the threat actor is, it's Russian intelligence services. So what's more valuable, gathering the intel, um, and being able to access all of Microsoft's corporate emails and be quiet about it? Um, so for me, when I think about this, why they went and made those additional applications, it's most likely for persistence and to just kind of be quiet, because gathering the intel is their primary motivator. And if they were able to just pull off, a mailbox of any user they wanted in Microsoft, if they want to just pull off all of them, that's really good intel. So they went above and beyond. And this is the difference between a nation state threat actor and someone who just wants to, create chaos or are primarily focused on financial gain. The threat actors who are focused on those things would have stopped here and just basically wrecked everything or done something to get, a financial payment, right? And they would have been done with it. But nation state threat actors are more focused on intelligence, typically, at least in this case, and they want to be quiet about it. They want to sit there and be quiet and maintain persistence. That's a pretty juicy target to have access not only to the Microsoft corporate environment whenever you want, but be able to read their emails and exfiltrate those emails. And if you read the blog post, Microsoft even mentions that that some of the data was exfiltrated. So the end of the day, that's what happened. This all occurred because insecure application permissions. Um, it occurred because there were bad permissions. It occurred because MFA was not enabled on that user in the test tenant. There's lots of reasons why it occurred. And you might be asking, well, it's Microsoft. Why did it happen? I mean, Microsoft's an organization just like anyone else. My guess is most likely this was just someone within the organization trying something out, or building some new application. Who knows? But this has happened to all of us where we just spin something up to try it out, or we spin something up to just work on something, and we might not take the best precautions like we would in production, not realizing that, in this case, the user might have even thought, or I don't know the full story, but in this case, they might have thought, well, it's a test tenant. It's not connected to the corporate one. It's fine. Who cares? Even if they get access to the test tenant, how are they going to get to the corporate, production tenant, without realizing that these applications have a connection? So cool. Appreciate the questions. Keep them coming in. Okay, so I think, yeah, we're good with the question there. So we talked through this. So at this point, the threat actor most likely had full access to the production tenant, but at the very least, we know that they granted themselves access to Exchange Online, full access as app, meaning they had full access to Exchange Online. And at that point, their attack path was complete. So what does that look like from an impact perspective? So we talked about this quite a bit, but just due to the permissions required, they most likely had full admin access over the production tenant. They wouldn't have been able to create the user. They wouldn't have been able to grant that full access as app role without elevated permissions in the tenant. And remember, Microsoft said that they detected the intrusion, the password spraying attack, in late November of 2023. They discovered it on January 12th. So the threat actors had 30 to 60 days, basically full access to the Microsoft tenant. I mean, what do you think the impact is to that? Being able to see, even if you just stick with emails and saying that they didn't really look at anything else, which they probably did, but even just sticking to emails, what kind of sensitive information can they find? they were exfiltrating those emails. So were they just pulling all those emails off for collection and they're going to analyze them later? Maybe who knows what they're going to find? We don't fully know the impact. What we do know, and Microsoft called out specifically, is that a lot of the actions that they took as far as searching mailboxes had to do with Midnight Blizzard themselves. So they had access to the emails and they want to see what Microsoft was saying about them. Again, they're an intelligence agency, so they want to know these kinds of things. All threat actors, well, not all threat actors do, but the smart ones do. So that's pretty big. That's pretty big, and I can't. I'm very surprised that it hasn't really blown up. I mean, of course, it was talked about in January, and um, I don't know how it didn't have a bigger news cycle because this is real. I mean, they had full access. If they didn't have full access, they had a step below of the Microsoft tenant. Couple of things that could have stopped this. They could have done better reviews of enterprise applications and manage them. Of course, I'm an offensive security guy, so of course I'm going to think about things like red teaming, full scope red teaming. There's a difference between having a narrow scope and a full scope. A full scope red teaming would have seen this test tenant sitting out there and would have performed a password spray attack on it. Attack surface management should have seen that test tenant sitting out there and been investigated. But one thing that you'll see a lot of organizations do is disable sign-in across the board. Um, they they just say no, you can't do this, or you require admin consent. So when you see that window, something says sign in with Microsoft, and you click the button and it comes up and it asks you all those hey, this application wants XYZ, and you say yes. You can set that so that the user needs admin consent to do it. Or you can just disable it altogether and just say, no, you can't. However, that's not so easy these days, and that has different business requirements. What we should be doing right now, simple stuff, enable MFA across the organization, require it. If MFA was enabled on that user in the test tenant, I'm not sure that it would have stopped them because there's things you can do to bypass that. It definitely would have slowed them down, no question about it. You should be reviewing enterprise applications in your tenant. So if you go into your Azure portal and you go to your Entra ID, there's in the navigation on the left there's an option for enterprise applications that will show you all the applications, whether they're your applications that were created in your tenant or other applications that were authorized through OAuth consent. That will show you all of them. And so you should be doing a regular review of that and see what applications live in your tenant, whether they're internal or external applications, and walking through, what kind of permissions do these applications have. There's some easier ways to pull them out with PowerShell and that kind of thing, but this is the most straightforward way. If you just go into the portal, go to your Entra ID and start to look at those. The one other thing is that when it comes to service principal abuse, there is the Microsoft Graph, which is the backbone of basically everything Microsoft. It's an API. So even when you're in the Azure portal and you log into the Azure portal, they're using the Microsoft Graph to show you whatever information you're looking at. And so quite often when you see service principal abuse is they will give themselves access to the Microsoft Graph application, and this application lives in everyone's tenant. Everyone has this. They will give themselves permissions to the Graph application, and then if that's an elevated permission, that's when they'll start to do nefarious things and maybe give themselves other permissions and do whatever it might be. But the point is that every tenant has a Microsoft Graph application in it. If you go to that enterprise applications, there's a filter there that says, I believe it's application type equals enterprise. If you remove that filter and look at all the applications, you'll see a whole bunch of Azure AD and Entra ID backbone applications. Microsoft Graph is in there. It's known as the Graph Aggregator Service. And so what you should do is you should go in there, look at the Graph Aggregator Service, and see what kind of users and groups and apps have permission to that. And not only that, what permissions do they actually have? Because that's how they can assign themselves permissions and roles and everything else programmatically. And that's usually an indicator that there's something going on.